Right now, across the Caribbean, the ground has been moving in a way that's genuinely keeping seismologists at multiple monitoring agencies busy simultaneously. In the first 2 weeks of August, alone, moderate earthquakes have rattled the Dominican Republic. The Mona Passage between Puerto Rico and Hispaniola has stayed active with its usual steady background hum of tremors. And just weeks before that, an earthquake struck in a location scientists almost never expect to see one, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest plate boundary. And all of this is unfolding in the same ocean basin that, back in June, produced one of the deadliest earthquake disasters this region has seen in generations. This isn't one single story. It's several different fault systems, all active at once, all being watched closely by different teams of scientists for very different reasons. Today, we're going to break down exactly what's shaking across the Caribbean right now, why this region is genuinely one of the most tectonically complicated places on the planet, and what specifically has researchers paying closer attention than usual. Subscribe to the channel before we get into this, because I track seismic activity across regions like this constantly, and the Caribbean specifically has quietly become one of the busiest corners of the planet from a monitoring standpoint over the past several months. Now let's start with the basics, because understanding why the Caribbean produces such a genuinely bizarre variety of earthquake types requires understanding just how many different tectonic pieces are jammed together in this relatively small ocean basin. Most people picture plate tectonics as a simple story. 2 plates, 1 boundary. Earthquakes happen along that line. The Caribbean is nothing like that. This region sits at the meeting point of the North American plate, the South American plate, the Caribbean plate itself, the small Gonave microplate wedged in around Haiti and Jamaica, and the Cocos and Nazca plates further to the west and south. These plates aren't just colliding head-on in one simple direction. Along the northern edge of the Caribbean plate, running from Cuba through Hispaniola and Puerto Rico, the motion is largely strike-slip, meaning the plates are grinding sideways past each other, similar in style to California's San Andreas Fault. But further east, past the Dominican Republic toward Puerto Rico and the Lesser Antilles, that motion becomes considerably more complex, partially transitioning into genuine subduction, where the North American plate actually dives underneath the Caribbean plate at an angle nearly parallel to the arc itself, an unusual geometry that produces the deep Puerto Rico trench and generates a distinct band of intermediate depth earthquakes occurring 70 to 300 kilometers down, well within the subducted slab of oceanic crust itself. And then, further south, along Venezuela's northern coast and out toward Trinidad, an entirely different fault system takes over, the Bocano-San Sebastian El Pilar system, a right lateral strike-slip zone stretching more than 1,300 kilometers that accommodates the sideways motion between the Caribbean and South American plates at a rate of roughly 10 millimeters a year. 3 fundamentally different styles of tectonic motion, strike-slip, oblique subduction, and transform faulting, all packed into one relatively compact region, which is exactly why the Caribbean produces such a genuinely wide variety of earthquake types, compared to almost anywhere else on Earth. Let's talk about what's actually been happening most recently, because there's genuine, active seismicity worth walking through here. On August 3rd, a magnitude 4. 5 earthquakes struck near Sanchez in the Dominican Republic, part of a broader pattern of continued activity across that country over the past month. Seismic tracking data shows the Dominican Republic recorded 29 separate earthquakes of magnitude 2, 5 or greater over just a 30-day stretch heading into July, including 1 magnitude 5. 0 event near Boca de Yuma that generated 125 individual felt reports from residents through the USGS Did You Feel It citizen reporting system, a genuinely strong signal that this wasn't some deep, barely perceptible tremor, but an earthquake that a meaningful number of people on the ground actually noticed and felt. Puerto Rico, meanwhile, continues to sit in its own state of near constant low-level activity, which is actually completely normal for this specific island. Puerto Rico experiences roughly 4,700 recorded earthquakes of magnitude 1, 0 or higher every single year, an average of nearly 13 quakes a day, the overwhelming majority far too small and too deep for anyone to ever feel. Earlier this year, a magnitude 5. 1 earthquake struck about 100 miles north of San Juan. An activity in the Mona Passage, the stretch of water separating Puerto Rico from the Dominican Republic, has continued through the summer, including renewed activity picked up by monitoring networks in mid-August. Now, here's where things get genuinely more interesting from a scientific standpoint, because not every earthquake in this recent stretch fits neatly into the patterns we just described. Back on June 8th, a magnitude 6. 1 earthquake struck near the western coast of Cuba, and USGS analysis of this event revealed something that immediately caught seismologists' attention. This earthquake occurred as reverse faulting, meaning compression pushing one block of rock up and over another at a shallow depth of about 26 kilometers, and it happened beneath the body of water south of the Florida's peninsula now officially referred to by you. Hess federal agencies as the Gulf of America, formerly known as the Gulf of Mexico. That location alone made this a genuinely unusual earthquake, because the USGS specifically classified it as an intraplate event, occurring some 400 to 450 kilometers north of the nearest active plate boundary between the North American and Caribbean sea plates. In plain terms, this earthquake happened in the geological equivalent of the middle of nowhere, deep inside a single tectonic plate, far removed from any of the boundaries where earthquakes are supposed to concentrate, according to standard plate tectonic theory. According to USGS records, this was the largest instrumentally recorded earthquake in the Gulf of America since 1950, and just one of only 6 earthquakes of magnitude 5 or larger ever recorded within that entire body of water going back to that same year. The only comparable historical event anywhere near this magnitude in the surrounding region was an approximately magnitude 6, a zero earthquake near San Cristobal, Cuba, all the way back in 1880. Why does an earthquake like this matter so much to scientists, even though it's smaller than some of the other events we're discussing today? Because intraplate earthquakes, ones that occur away from the well-mapped, well-understood boundaries between major tectonic plates, are genuinely difficult to explain and even harder to forecast using the standard models geologists rely on for boundary zone earthquakes. When the interior of a supposedly stable plate produces a significant earthquake like this, it tells researchers that ancient buried fault structures deep within what looks like a geologically quiet region can still be capable of releasing meaningful stress that's often been slowly accumulating from broader plate motion for a very long time without any obvious surface signal that it's building. This is exactly the same broader scientific category that produced an unusual magnitude, 6. 6 earthquake near Antigua back in 2023, an event researchers described at the time as reflecting diffuse deformation of the oceanic crust itself, meaning the plate wasn't cleanly slipping along one well-defined fault the way a classic plate boundary earthquake does, but instead distributing strain across a broader, more complex zone of weaker rock, a phenomenon scientists have compared to the mechanics behind the massive 2012 magnitude 8. 6 earthquake that struck a similarly diffused deformation zone out in the Indian Ocean. Put together, these events are building an increasingly clear picture that the Caribbean isn't just dangerous along its obvious, well-mapped plate boundaries. It's capable of producing genuinely significant, difficult-to-predict earthquakes from structures buried well within what used to be considered comparatively stable interior crust. All of this recent activity is unfolding against the backdrop of the single most devastating earthquake this region has experienced in generations. And it's impossible to talk honestly about what scientists are watching in the Caribbean right now without acknowledging it directly. On June 24, 2026, Venezuela was struck by a catastrophic earthquake doublet, a magnitude 7. 2 foreshock followed just 30 seconds later by a magnitude 7. 5 main shock, both occurring along that same Boconó-San Sebastián El Pilar fault system we talked about earlier, the shallow strike-slip plate boundary running along Venezuela's northern coast. As of this month, the confirmed death toll from that disaster has climbed past 6,300 people, with roughly 73,300 people hospitalized and tens of thousands still reported missing. That earthquake sits at the extreme end of what this region is capable of producing, and it's exactly the kind of event that puts every other fault system in the broader Caribbean under heightened scrutiny in its aftermath. Not because these systems are mechanically connected to what happened in Venezuela, but because a disaster of that scale is a stark, undeniable reminder of what these plate boundaries have proven repeatedly throughout the historical record they are fully capable of producing. That history runs deep across this entire region, and it's worth walking through specifically because it shapes exactly why scientists treat certain zones with more concern than others. The Puerto Rico Trench, formed by that unusual arc-parallel subduction of the North American plate beneath the Caribbean plate, is considered by researchers to be capable of generating a genuine megathrust earthquake, the same category of event responsible for disasters like the 2011 Tohoku quake in Japan, but there hasn't been one in over a century. The last probable interplate thrust event along this specific zone occurred all the way back on May 2nd, 1787, an earthquake widely felt across the island with documented destruction stretching along the entire northern coast, including in Arecibo and San Juan. Since 1900, the 2 largest earthquakes in this broader region have been the August 1946 magnitude 8, 0 Samana earthquake in northeastern Hispaniola, and the July 1943 magnitude 7, 6 Mona Passage earthquake, both genuinely massive events by any measure. That's nearly 240 years since the last confirmed major thrust rupture, along the Puerto Rico Trench specifically, which is exactly the kind of extended quiet period that makes seismologists Pay closer attention rather than less, since a long gap since the last major release along a fault capable of producing this scale of earthquake generally means stress has continued accumulating throughout that entire silence. Further west, along the boundary running through Haiti and the Dominican Republic, sits the Enriquillo Plantain Garden Fault Zone, a system with its own brutal recent history. In January 2010, a magnitude 7.0 earthquake struck Haiti's capital, Port-au-Prince, killing hundreds of thousands of people in one of the deadliest earthquakes in modern history, a death toll driven overwhelmingly by the combination of shallow, violent shaking and widespread unreinforced construction in one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. Just over a decade later, in August 2021, a magnitude 7, 2 earthquakes struck along that same fault zone, killing hundreds more. And even outside of major rupture events, this broader zone continues producing smaller but still significant activity, including a magnitude 4. We'll see why one earthquake that struck near Port-au-Prince as recently as last summer widely felt across the capital even though it caused no reported damage. Then there's the Cayman Trough, sitting along the boundary of the small Gonave microplate wedged between Cuba, Jamaica, and Hispaniola. This zone has produced 2 genuinely major earthquakes in just the past several years alone. Back in January 2020, a magnitude 7 earthquake struck along the Septentrional Oriente Fault Zone north of Jamaica, generating a small tsunami measured at about 1.5 feet at Georgetown in the Cayman Islands. Though remarkably, this massive earthquake produced 0 recorded casualties, a genuinely strong demonstration of how effective regional tsunami warning coordination and building preparedness can be even when the underlying earthquake itself is enormous. Then in February of last year, a magnitude 7.6 earthquake struck southwest of the Cayman Islands, prompting the U.S. National Tsunami Warning Center to issue a tsunami advisory for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands, while officials in the Cayman Islands and the Dominican Republic both urged coastal residents to move inland and toward higher ground. As a precaution, even though the eventual wave heights stayed in the modest range of roughly 1 foot to 3 feet and never posed any threat to the U.S. mainland. So when you step back and look at everything happening across the Caribbean simultaneously right now, the recent Dominican Republic activity, the unusual intraplate quake, off Cuba, the continued background hum near Puerto Rico and the Mona Passage, all sitting in the shadow of the catastrophic Venezuela disaster from earlier this summer, what you're really looking at is one of the most tectonically layered, historically active regions on the entire planet, doing what it has always done, just compressed into a particularly visible and closely monitored stretch of several months. Seismologists aren't watching this activity because they believe these individual earthquakes are somehow connected to each other in a direct causal chain. They're watching because this region contains multiple genuinely dangerous fault systems, several of them significantly overdue for a major release based on historical recurrence patterns, all sitting beneath a rapidly growing population spread across islands and coastal cities with widely varying levels of seismic building preparedness. If you live anywhere across the Caribbean and Puerto Rico, the Dominican Republic, Haiti, Cuba, the Cayman Islands, or anywhere along that broader arc, this is genuinely a good moment to take stock of your own preparedness, rather than waiting for the next major event to force the issue. Know where you'd shelter during shaking, generally under sturdy furniture, away from windows and anything that could realistically fall. Have a basic emergency kit ready with enough water, food, and any necessary medications to last at least 72 hours, since infrastructure and transportation can be disrupted for days following a significant earthquake, especially on an island where supply routes are inherently more limited than on a mainland. If you live anywhere near the coast, know your tsunami evacuation route in advance, and understand that if you ever feel strong or prolonged shaking near the water, you don't wait for an official warning before moving to higher ground, because the most dangerous tsunami scenarios can arrive faster than any alert system is capable of reaching you. And if you have family members who are elderly or who might need extra help getting somewhere safe quickly, talk through a plan with them now, not in the middle of an actual emergency. I'll be tracking this region closely over the coming weeks, especially watching whether activity continues near the Dominican Republic and the Mona Passage, and whether researchers publish any additional analysis on that unusual intraplate earthquake off Cuba. Since events like that tend to generate meaningful follow-up research precisely because they don't fit neatly into existing models. If any of these systems shows a significant change, I'll bring you a complete update the moment that happens. Subscribe so you don't miss that follow-up, and drop a comment below if you live anywhere across the Caribbean, and let me know if you felt any of this recent activity yourself. I read every one of these, and hearing directly from people living through this gives everyone else watching a much clearer sense of what these numbers on a seismograph actually mean for real communities on the ground. Stay earthquake aware, keep that emergency plan current, and I will see you in the next one.